Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nimh by Robert C. O'Brien. Day 2. Mr. Fitzgibbon's Plough. When Mrs. Frisby went into her house, she found Timothy asleep and the other children waiting, frightened, sad, and subdued. "He went to sleep right after you left," Teresa said. "He's waked up twice, and the second time he wasn't delirious. He said his chest hurt and his head hurt. But, Mother, he seemed so weak, he could hardly talk. He asked where you were, and I told him. Then he went back to sleep." Mrs. Frisby went to where Timothy lay, a small ball of damp fur curled under a bit of cloth blanket. He looked scarcely larger than he had when she and Mr. Frisby had carried him to Mr. Age's as an infant, and the thought of that trip made her wish Mr. Frisby were alive to reassure the children and tell them not to worry. But he was not, and it was she who must say it. "Don't worry," she said. "Mr. Ages gave me some medicine for him and says he will recover." She mixed the contents of one of the packets, a gray-green powder, in water, and then gently shook Timothy awake. He smiled. "You're back," he said in a small voice as small as a whisper. "I'm back, and I brought you some medicine. Mr. Ages says it will make you all right." She lifted his head on her arm, and he swallowed the medicine. "I expect it's bitter," she said. "It's not so bad," he said. "It tastes like pepper." And he fell back to sleep immediately. The next morning, as predicted, his fever was lower, his breathing grew easier, and his heartbeat slowed down. Still, that day he slept 7 hours out of each 8. The next day he stayed awake longer, and on the third day he had no fever at all, just as Mr. Ages had said. However, since Mr. Ages had been right in all that, Mrs. Frisby knew he was sure to have been right in the other things he had said. Timothy was not really strong yet. He must stay in bed, stay warm, and breathe only warm air. During those 3 days she had stayed close by his side, but on the 4th she felt cheerful enough to go for a walk, and also to fetch some more of the corn from the stump so they could have it for supper. She went out her front door into the sunshine and was surprised to find a spring day waiting for her. The weather had turned warm while she had stayed indoors. February was over, and March had come in, as they say, like a lamb. There was a smell of dampness in the air as the frosted ground thawed, a smell of things getting ready to grow. It made her feel even more cheerful than before, and she walked almost gaily across the garden. And yet, despite the fine warmth of the day, indeed, in a way, because of it, Mrs. Frisby could not quite get rid of a nagging worry that kept flickering in her mind. It was the kind of worry that, if you pushed it out of this corner of your thoughts, pops up in that corner, and finally in the middle, where it has to be faced. It was the thought of moving day. Everybody knows that the groundhog comes up from the deep hole where he has slept away the winter, looks around, and if he decides the cold weather is not over, goes back down to sleep for another 6 weeks. Field mice, like Mrs. Frisby, are not so lucky. When winter is over, they must move out of the garden and back to the meadow or the pasture. For as soon as the weather allows, Farmer Fitzgibbon's tractor comes rumbling through, pulling the sharp-bladed plow through the soil, turning over every foot of it. No animal caught in the garden that day is likely to escape alive, and all the winter homes, all the tunnels and holes and nests and cocoons are torn up. After the plow comes the harrow, with its heavy creaking discs, and then the people with hoes and seeds. Not all the field mice move into the garden for the winter, of course. Some find their way to barn lofts, some even creep into people's houses and live under the eaves or in attics, taking their chances with mouse traps. But the Frisbys had always come to the garden, preferring the relative safety and freedom of the outdoors. Moving day, therefore, depends on the weather, and that is why a fine day set Mrs. Frisby worrying, even as she enjoyed it. As soon as the frost was out of the ground, the plow would come, and that could happen as much as a month earlier or later one year than the last. And the worry was this: if it came too soon, Timothy would not be able to move. He was supposed to stay in bed, and moving meant a long walk across the field of winter wheat, up and down the hill to the brook's edge, where the Frisbys made their summer home. Not only that, the home itself would be damp and chilly for the first few weeks, as summer homes always are, until early spring turned to late spring and the nights grew truly warm. This was something that Mrs. Frisby and the children did not ordinarily mind. Moving day, in fact, was normally a gay time, for it marked the end of the gray weather and the frost. It was like the beginning of a summer holiday. But this year, now that Mrs. Frisby had faced the problem, she did not see any answer except to hope that the day would not come too early. In another month, according to Mr. Ages, Timothy would be strong enough. Perhaps she was only borrowing trouble. One warm day, she told herself, does not make a summer. No, nor even a spring. She walked on through the garden and saw ahead of her a small figure she knew. It was a lady shrew, a tiny thing scarcely bigger than a peanut, but with a wit as sharp as teeth. She lived in a simple hole in the ground a few yards away. Mrs. Frisby met her often and had grown to like her, though shrews are generally unpopular, having a reputation for short tempers and extremely large appetites. "Good morning," said Mrs. Frisby. "Ah, Mrs. Frisby, good morning indeed. Too good is what I'm thinking." The shrew was holding a stalk of straw, which she now thrust into the earth. It went down easily for 2 inches or more before it bent in her hand. "Look at that! The top of the frost is all gone already. Another few days like this, and it will be all gone. Then we will have the tractor in here again, breaking everything up." "So soon? Do you really think so?" asked Mrs. Frisby, her worry returning in a rush stronger than before. "He plows when the frost is gone. Remember the spring of '65? That year he plowed on the 11th day of March, and on Sunday at that. I moved down to the woods that night and nearly froze to death in a miserable hollow log. And that day came after a week of days just like this." Mrs. Frisby did remember it. Her family, too, had shivered through those chilly nights. For the fact was, the earlier moving day came, the colder the nights were likely to be. "Oh, dear," she said. "I hope it doesn't happen happen this year. Poor Timothy's too sick to move." "Sick, is he? Take him to Mr. Age's. I've been myself, but he was too weak to get out of bed, and still is. I'm sorry to hear that. Then we must hope for another frost, or that the tractor will break down. I wish someone would drive a tractor through his house and see how he likes it." So muttering, the lady shrew moved off, and Mrs. Frisby continued across the garden. The remark was illogical, of course, for they both knew that without Mr. Fitzgibbon's plow there would be no garden to live in at all, and there was no way he could turn the earth without also turning up their houses. Or was there? What the shrew had said was meant to be sympathetic, but it was not helpful. It meant Mrs. Frisby realized that she, too, could see no solution to the problem, but that did not mean that there was none. She remembered something her husband, Mrs. Frisby, used to say: "All doors are hard to unlock until you have the key." "All right," she said. All right, she must try to find the key. But where? Whom to ask? And then, as if to make things worse, she heard a sound that filled her with alarm. It came from across the fence in the farmyard, a loud, sputtering roar. It was Mr. Fitzgibbon starting his tractor. 5 days. The sound of the tractor did not necessarily mean that Mr. Fitzgibbon was getting ready to plow. He used it for many other things, hauling hay and firewood, for instance, mowing and clearing snow in the winter. Mrs. Frisby reminded herself of all this as she hurried over to the corner post. That was a very thick fence post at the corner of the garden nearest the farmhouse and the tractor shed. She had discovered long ago that it had, a few inches above the ground, a convenient knot-hole with a hollow space behind it in which she could hide, when she had reason to, and watch what was going on in the yard. The cat, Dragon, also knew of its existence, so she had to look sharply when she came out. She came up carefully behind the post, stared this way and that, and then darted around it and up into the hole. All clear. Mr. Fitzgibbon had backed the tractor out of the big cluttered shed where he kept it. Leaving the motor idling, he climbed down from the seat and called to the house. In a moment, his older son Paul came out, closing the door carefully behind him. Paul, at 15, was a quiet, hard-working boy, rather clumsy in his movements, but strong and careful about his chores. In a few seconds, he was followed by his younger brother, Billy, who at age 12 was noisier and had an annoying habit of skimming rocks across the grass at anything that moved. Mrs. Frisby did not much care for Billy. "All right, boys," said Mr. Fitzgibbon, "let's haul it out and see about that linchpin. It was just about worn through last fall, I remember," Paul said. The boys disappeared into the shed, and Mr. Fitzgibbon remounted the tractor. He turned it around and backed it slowly toward the shed, so that the rear end was out of Mr. Frisby's sight. There was some clanking and clanging inside the shed, while Mr. Fitzgibbon, looking over his shoulder, worked some levers on the side of the tractor. "All set?" He shifted gears and eased the tractor forward again. Hitched behind it, clear of the ground, was the plow. Mrs. Frisby's heart sank. Surely he was not going to start now. But as soon as he had the plow out in the sunlight, Mr. Fitzgibbon turned the tractor's engine off. It died with a sputter, and they all gathered around the plow hitch. "Sure enough," said Mr. Fitzgibbon, "she's just about ready to shear. Paul, I'm glad you remembered that. If I order it today, Henderson's will have a new one in 3 or 4 days." "It took 5 days last time," Paul said. "5 then. That's just about right anyway. It's too wet to plow now, but 5 days like this ought to dry the ground out. Let's grease up while we've got it out. Billy, get the grease gun." In her hiding place, Mr. Frisby breathed a sigh of relief and then began to worry again immediately. 5 days, although a respite, was too short. 3 weeks, Mr. Ages had said, would be the soonest Timothy could get out of bed, the soonest he could live through a chill night without getting pneumonia again. She sighed and felt like weeping. If only the summer house were as warm as the cinder-block house. But it was not, and even if it were, he could not make the long journey. They might try to carry him, but what was the use of that, only to have him get sick again after the first night there? She might, she thought, go back to Mr. Ages and see if he had any ideas that would help him. Was there some medicine that would make Timothy get stronger sooner? She doubted it. Surely, if he had such medicine, he would have given it to her the first time. She was thinking about this when she climbed out through the knothole and slithed to the ground below, not 10 feet from the cat. Dragon lay stretched out in the sunlight, but he was not asleep. His head was up, and his yellow eyes were open, staring in her direction. She gasped in terror and whirled around the fence post to put it between her and him. Then, without pausing, she set out on a dash across the garden as fast as she could run, expecting at any instant to hear the cat scream and feel his great claws on her back. She reached the shrew's hole and considered for a fraction of a second diving into it, but it was too small. Then she glanced back over her shoulder and saw an amazing sight. The cat had not moved at all. He was lying exactly as before, except that now one of his eyes was closed. The other one was still looking straight at her, so she did not pause, but raced on. Finally, when she was a safe distance away, 2/3 across the garden and nearly home, she stopped and looked again more carefully. The cat still lay there and seemed to have gone to sleep. That was so odd, so unheard of, she could hardly believe it. Feeling quite safe but puzzled, she looked for a vantage point from which she could see better. By rights, she should be dead, and though she had escaped by what seemed almost a miracle, she scolded herself for having been so careless. If the cat had killed her, who would take care of the children? She saw a dead asparagus plant, stiff, tall, and branches like a small tree. She climbed it, and from near the top looked back to the farmyard. Mr. Fitzgibbon and his sons had finished greasing the tractor and gone somewhere else, but the cat still lay on the grass, seemingly asleep. Why had he not chased her? Was it possible that, close as she had been, he had not seen her? She could not believe that. The only explanation she could think of was that he had just finished a very large meal and was feeling so stuffed and lazy he did not want to take the trouble to get up. But that was almost as unbelievable. Certainly it had never happened before. Was it possible that he was sick? Then, on what had already been a day of oddities and alarms, she noticed something else strange. Beyond the cat, quite far beyond, between the barn and the house, she saw what looked like a troop of dark gray figures marching in columns. Marching? Not exactly, but moving slowly and all in line. They were rats. There were a dozen of them, and at first she could not quite see what they were up to. Then she saw something moving between them and behind them. It looked like a thick piece of rope, a long piece, maybe 20 feet. No, it was stiffer than rope. It was electric cable, the heavy black kind used for outdoor wiring and strung on telephone poles. The rats were hauling it laboriously through the grass, inching it along in the direction of a very large wild rose bush in the far corner of the yard. Mrs. Frisby quickly guessed where they were taking it, though she could not guess why. In that rose bush, concealed and protected by dense tangles of fiercely sharp thorns, was the entrance to a rat hole. All the animals knew about it and were careful to stay away. But what would the rats want with such a long piece of wire? Mrs. Frisby could not imagine. Even more curious, how did they dare to pull it across the yard in the broad daylight when the cat was right there? The rats were bigger than Mrs. Frisby and could be, when necessarily, dangerous fighters, but they were no match for Dragon. She watched them for quite a long time. It was obvious that they knew exactly what they were doing, and they looked as well drilled as a group of soldiers. They had about 25 yards to go to reach the rose bush, as if at a signal, which, however, she was too far away to hear. They would all pull together, moving the wire about a foot. Then they would pause, rest, and heave again. It was about 20 minutes before the first rat disappeared into the bush. A little later, the last bit of wire disappeared behind them like a thin black snake, and Mrs. Frisby climbed down from the asparagus bush. All that time, the cat had slept on. A favor from Jeremy. In her worry about moving day and watching the tractor, the cat, and finally the rats, Mrs. Frisby had forgotten that she had set out originally to get some corn for supper. Now she remembered it, so instead of continuing to her house, she turned toward the far corner of the garden and the stump at the edge of the woods beyond. She was a little weird after her dash from the cat, so she walked along slowly, feeling the warmth of the sun and the smell of the breeze. This mild breeze, carrying the moist essence of early spring, caused a dead leaf to flutter here and there, and across the garden near the fence it moved something that sparkled in the sunlight. This caught the corner of Mrs. Frisby's eye. She glanced at it, saw that it was only a bit of tin foil or aluminum foil, blown from somewhere, and she looked away again. Then she looked back, for at that moment a black object plummeted from the sky, and she recognized her friend Jeremy the Crow. A thought crossed Mrs. Frisby's mind. She changed direction again, and moving more quickly, ran across the earth to where Jeremy stood. He was hopping around the shiny piece of foil, eyeing it from one direction and another. What had occurred to Mrs. Frisby was that although Jeremy was not the brightest of animals she had met, and though he was young, he knew things and places she did not, and one had to begin somewhere. As she approached him, he had picked up the foil in his beak and was spreading his wings to fly off. "Wait, please," she called. He turned, folded his wings, and then replaced the foil carefully on the ground. "Hello," he said. "You remember me?" "Of course. You saved me from the cat." Then he added, "What do you think of this piece of foil?" Mrs. Frisby looked at it without much interest. "It's just a piece of foil," she said. "It's not very big." "True, but it's shiny, especially when the sun strikes it just so." "Why are you so interested in shiny things?" "Well, really I'm not. At least not very. But I have a friend who likes them, so when I see one, I pick it up." "I see. That's very thoughtful." "And would the friend be female?" "As a matter of fact, yes, she is." "How did you know?" "Just a guess," said Mrs. Frisby. "Do you remember saying once that if I needed help, I might ask you?" "I do. Any time. Just ask for Jeremy. Any of the crows can find me. And now, if you'll excuse me," he bent over to pick up the foil again. "Please don't go yet," said Mrs. Frisby. "I think perhaps you can help me now." "Ah," said Jeremy. "What kind of help? Are you hungry? I'll bring you some seeds from the barn loft. I know where they're stored." "No, thank you," said Mrs. Frisby. "We have enough to eat." And then she told him, as briefly as she could, about Timothy, his sickness, and the problem of moving day. Jeremy knew about moving day. Crows do not have to move, but they need to keep a close watch on such activities as plowing and planting so as to get their fair share of what's planted. And with the sharp eyes, they see the small animals leaving before the plow. So he clucked sympathetically when he heard Mrs. Frisby's story, cocked his head to one side, and thought as hard as he could for as long as he could, which was about 30 seconds. His eyes closed with the effort. "I don't know what you should do," he said finally. "I'm sorry, but maybe I can help even so. At least I can tell you what we do when we don't know what to do." "We?" "The crows. Most of the birds." "What do you do then?" "Over that way." Jeremy nodded into the direction of the deep woods and faraway mountains that rose behind the fence. "About a mile from here there grows a very large beech tree, the biggest tree in the whole forest. Near the top of the tree there is a hollow in the trunk. In the hollow lives an owl, who is the oldest animal in the woods, some say in the world. When we don't know what to do, we ask him. Sometimes he answers our questions, sometimes he doesn't. It depends on how he feels, or, as my father used to say, what kind of humor he's in. Or possibly, thought Mrs. Frisby, on whether or not he knows the answer. But she said, "Could you ask him, then, if he knows of any help for me?" She did not think it likely that he would. No," Jeremy said. "That won't do. That is, I could ask him, but I don't think the owl will listen. Imagine, a crow come to ask for help for a lady mouse with a sick child. He wouldn't believe me." "Then what's to be done?" "What's to be done? You must go yourself and ask him." "But I could never find the tree, and if I did, I don't think I could climb so high." "Ah, now, that is where I can help. As I said I would. I will carry you there on my back, the way I did before, and home again, of course." Mrs. Frisby hesitated. It was one thing to leap on a crow's back when the cat is only 3 jumps away and coming fast, but quite another to do it deliberately and to fly deep into the dark and unknown forest. In short, Mrs. Frisby was afraid. Then she thought of Timothy and of the big steel plow blade. She told herself, "I have no choice. If there is any that the owl might be able to help me, any chance that the owl might be able to help me, to advise me, I must go." She said to Jeremy, "Thank you very much. I will go and talk to the owl if he will take me. It's a great favor." "It's nothing," said Jeremy. "You're welcome, but we can't go now." "Why not?" "In the daytime, when the sun is out, the owl goes deep into the hollow and sleeps. That is, they say he sleeps, but I don't believe it. How could anyone sleep so long? I think he sits in there, part of the time at least, and thinks, and that's why he knows so much. But anyway, he won't speak in the daytime, not to anyone. And at night he's out flying and hunting." "I know," said Mrs. Frisby, and that was another reason to be afraid. "The time to see him is just at dusk. Then, when the light gets dim, he comes to the entrance of the hollow and watches while the dark comes in. That's the time to ask him questions." "I understand," said Mrs. Frisby. "Shall we go this evening?" "At 5 o'clock, Jeremy said. "I'll be at your house." He picked up the piece of foil in his bill, waved goodbye, and flew off. The owl. Jeremy appeared as promised when the last thumbnail of the sun winked out over the mountains beyond the meadow. Mrs. Frisby was waiting. her heart pounding in her ears, and the three of her children were there to watch. Teresa and Martin standing beside their mother, and Cynthia, who was afraid of the crow, just a pair of round eyes peering out the round doorway. Timothy was down below, taking a nap, and had not been told about the expedition, lest he would worry and blame himself for the risk his mother must take. Indeed, the words moving day had not been mentioned in his presence. Even to the other children, Mrs. Frisby had explained only part of the problem. That is, she had not told them that there were only 5 days left, nor anything about Mr. Fitzgibbon and the tractor. She did not want them to worry either. Jeremy landed with a swoosh and a bit dramatically, perhaps, and nodded at the children and Mrs. Frisby. "Hello," he said. "Here I am." Mrs. Frisby introduced Martin and Teresa in Cynthia's eyes. Martin, who wished he were going on the trip himself, asked Jeremy in excitement, How high can you fly?" "Oh, I don't know exactly," Jeremy said. "A couple of miles, I guess. Mother, did you hear? You'll be 2 miles up in the air. Martin, it won't be necessary to go so high on this trip." Jeremy said cheerfully, "No, but I can, if you'd like." "No, thank you. I wouldn't think of your taking the trouble." She was trying hard to hide her terror, and Martin had not helped matters at all. But Jeremy suddenly saw that she was trembling, and realized that she must be afraid. "It's all right," he said kindly. "There's nothing to be nervous about. I fly over the woods a dozen times a day." "Yes," thought Mrs. Frisby, "but you're not riding on your back, and you can't fall." "All right," she said as bravely as she could. "I'm ready. Teresa and Martin, take care of Timothy until I come back, and be sure you don't tell them where I've gone." With a small light leap, she was on Jeremy's back, lying as flat as she could and holding tight to the glossy feathers between his wings, as a horseback rider grips the horse's mane before a jump. Martin and Teresa waved goodbye, but she did not see them, for she had her face pressed against the feathers and her eyes closed. Once again she felt the surge of power as the crow's broad wings beat down against the air. This time it lasted longer, for they were going higher than before. The beating became gentler as they leveled off, and then to her alarm it stopped altogether. What was wrong?